Yeah, cool.
Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to the Asia Tech Podcast. Glenn Lai, a co-founder and the CEO of FR8Labs, is with us today. Glenn, thank you so much for coming to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It is my complete pleasure. Let's give the listeners a little bit of your background for some context, yeah?
For sure. So I'm Glenn. I'm a Singaporean born and bred, but I kind of didn't do the usual Singaporean thing, which is go to a MNC or whatever. I actually was hired in a conglomerate that was less well known in this area. It's listed in Singapore. It's this company called Golden Agri. It's actually a Indonesian conglomerate, actually. Right? So it's the palm oil section of the Indonesian conglomerate. I was hired in Singapore, but 2 weeks in, they sent me to Indonesia. It was supposed to be a 3-week project. I ended up spending 7 years there. So that's where I kind of have not the most normal Singaporean career, if you may, right? And I had a great time there. I was working in the CEO office. And so I had both that luxury, or sometimes some people say the curse, right, of working through the entire value chain.
Yeah.
Because I kind of worked with the CEO, the family, to kind of figure out how could we we had strategic projects on how could we increase the profitability or maximize the assets across the value chain. Typical Indonesian conglomerate, which means that we own every part of the chain. So we had palm oil, the plantation, the refinery, which then did massive exports. We had the vessels to do the massive exports globally. We had the entire industrial type product like margarine shortening. We had the consumer product, which is the palm oil, the cooking oil version of it. We had the trucks, the logistics arm that kind of deals with that. And then we also had our own distribution arm to get it to the stores. So as you can imagine, right, I spent a very interesting career spanning through that. Of course, I was in Indonesia. When I first arrived in Indonesia, tech was still very early. But in about year 3, year 4 of Indonesia, that's when we saw Goto or rather Gojek and Tokopedia independently, right? At that point, rise up, right? And so I, seeing that from the sidelines, was super interested in those businesses. But I was in that conglomerate. So I because I had that luxury of working through all the business units, I also had the luxury to therefore say, hey, I want to get myself into this. What's the best way within this context that I had? So I ended up choosing to spend my time in the tail end of the business, which is the consumer products business, where we had the actual brand as well as the distribution arm to bring goods from our factories to store. So that was a very interesting, I would say, choice that not many people had. I ended up doing head of strategy and head of digital there. So that was the business unit I felt that had the most capability to really do a digital business model, because you can't really have digital palm oil, right? So we ended up doing that in the consumer products. And the reason why we felt that there was the opportunity was because Indonesia, different from different from Singapore, I would say, is that you still have most of goods going through what we call general trade, which is the regular mom and pop store on the street.
Yeah.
And so there were about 3.5 million mom and pop grocery stores that we dealt with. And it was still a day and age where we were sending physical salesmen to store, to 20 stores a day in their area to visit to get sales, right? So that was very interestingly that the entire digital business model could be built out of that. And of course, we saw the rise of many players in that. Warung Pintar, Mitra Bukalapak, Ula, right? Gudang Ada, right? And so on and so forth. And so we kind of started our own internal version first. And the Cinemas Group, being the Cinemas Group, right, had to create ambition to their credit, which ended up then allowing us to go through a merger with a few different of the assets, right, to try to build a Alibaba-esque type version of that. We had a startup, we had 2 offline assets coming together. Through that group was called Busy Group, which I ended up therefore becoming like building the digital business model for the offline assets. So we had 2 offline assets. We had the freight forwarding, 3PL, and the distribution business. And then I ended up building my own, in a sense, internal entrepreneurship, internal business unit called Busy Digital, which was a B2B e-commerce marketplace, building on that, the internal initial strategy anyway. Did that for a good time, and then ended up getting acquired by Warung Pintar, right? One of our competitors or frenemies, if you may, right? And it was at that point of time, it was COVID. My first son was born. I was like, okay, you know what? I need to come back to Singapore. So I left after the merger, came back to Singapore, did a few different things before starting FR8Labs.
This company that you worked for, what was it called? Golden Agri, the palm oil business. This is part of Cinemas.
Yes.
Okay, so this gets really interesting now. So if you go back to when you joined Cinemas, you're working in the CEO's office of Golden Agri or of Cinemas
Yep.
itself.
I mean, so Cinemas is the family name and it's an Indonesian name. Actually, Cinemas literally means golden light. So, all the Singapore versions are all called golden, if you may. Yeah.
So you're sitting working in the CEO's office. You said it was a curse and you said it was what did you say?
Luxury and a curse.
A luxury and a curse. I think it was more of a luxury than anything else. I mean, the curse is just a time sink more than anything, but the luxury is you get to sit in one of the largest conglomerates in Indonesia, who, by the way, were investors in e-commerce, invested in a bunch of other startups, right? So one of the most kind of proactive ones. But I'm curious from your standpoint, what is it like when you're working in the CEO's office? You can feel what's going on around you in the market, right? All this stuff is happening. Gojek launches, Grab is happening in another country. All these things are happening. You're a kid, basically. When you walk into the CEO's office and say, I think we need to be involved at scale in this digital business, what were those conversations like? Like, how long did it take to convince them? Because they're very forward thinking, right?
Okay, so this is a very interesting layer. Well, there are two parts to this, right? So let's talk about the Cinemas group in essence a bit first. Then it goes into the more detail of how did I eventually get there. So the reality is exactly as you say. I think Cinemas as a group is very, very, very forward thinking,
Yeah.
right? And so the family, the senior execs are all quite, in that sense, open to this, but they're also very realistic in the sense that they recognize the realities of their existing business
Right.
as well. And so it's not easy to move that conglomerate to that direction.
Sure.
That's why they also have different spin-offs. You have SMDV, right, which basically does a lot of these investments and try to bring it back to the group. And also you have a lot of internal initiatives now showing from an internal perspective, right, trying to mimic and add value in those levels. So I think to their credit, definitely very forward-thinking group. That being said, internally, yes, it was not an easy conversation, right? So being fresh in the CEO's office, right, was a very interesting phenomena, which is that I was always the youngest in the room.
For sure.
And very common. And the worst part was, well, again, luxury and curse, right, is that I had that luxury to always be, in that sense, thrown into a room by my CEO because he's the group CEO or the downstream group CEO. So he manages a set of CEOs as well himself. And so I'm going in to help these very experienced Indonesian CEOs as well. And so I'm always the youngest in the room, made a ton of mistakes through that.
For sure.
This part, definitely luxury, is that because I was from CEO office, I had the luxury to really kind of come in, take a step back, ask stupid questions, and look at things from fresh eyes most of the time, which a lot of these operating CEOs don't have the time to do. And so that's where I kind of found my sweet spot, which is that how can I help these CEOs to really do things that they know that they should do, but they don't really have the time to do.
Yeah.
Right. And uncover, strategic opportunities or fix real problems, right? Strategic problems, right? As a free resource, right? So that's kind of how we kind of structured it. So I was like from the group. And so you're not on your P&L, I'm not going to impact your incentive, right? In fact, it's your incentive to work with me. So that's kind of how we kind of structured it, a bit like an internal consulting. That's how we eventually formed to it. But there were 4 of us to start, and I was the only one left. So it's not easy, I must say. It takes a bit of different personality, I would say.
I don't know if you know this, right? But I was a limited partner in Ardent Capital. So I've been living in Thailand since the end of 2011, beginning of 2012. And when I looked around the ecosystem, let's just say in the whole region, right, there were plenty of these big family businesses. And I always had this imaginary story where like one of the grandsons of the founders would go in and say, hey, Grandpa, this business we have is great. E-commerce is starting to happen. And if we build this e-commerce business, we already have the suppliers. We already have the warehouses. Like you said, we're vertically integrated. We already have the logistics. We could dominate in the e-commerce space. And I always imagined the grandfather or the founder saying something like, awesome. We always want to do new businesses. If I give you $25 million, what's going to be my ROE? And I always imagined the grandson or the granddaughter going, could be 0. And then the founder just going, okay, well, we need 8% to 12% annualized returns because that's what we've always had since our founding. I'm not going to invest in that. And that's why I asked you that question, right? Because it really takes somebody who wants to take a risk at that level because the revenues are high, right? Like the biggest revenue company in this country has $65 billion a year of revenue, right? So to make a difference, it has to be $1 billion of revenue, not like 10 million. That's why I asked you that question. So from your perspective, it's super interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
So I think you're absolutely right, right? I think there is that natural intellectual tendency to say, these guys won't do it because they already have other options. And I do think that's true to a large extent, especially if you talk about a very big ticket size. But I do think that they are also very aware and they've seen how VCs operate. And with small ticket sizes, it's a bit different. And I think there are case studies, especially in Southeast Asia, that has spin off very valuable enterprises, right? Or startups,
Yeah.
right? Through this, right? I think a great example is Ovo with the Lippo group. Ovo's story, I was kind of, again, I knew some of the internal stories because with Busy, we were lucky to have some of the very senior guys of Ovo work with us. And so Ovo, I think, was kind of incubated by the Lippo group. And at the start, it created chaos. But basically what Lippo/Ovo famously did was that they implemented at all their shopping malls car parks, right? That for you to get out of the car park, you must use the Ovo app. It created chaos because there were people who really didn't have the app and all this
Like, how do I get out of
digital
here
wallets.
now?
Yeah, then now you're stuck at the and then you're trying to sign up and it was chaos, but that really drove adoption like
Right.
through the roof, and they, in my opinion, did it in the most cost efficient manner. So I think there are ways that it can work, right? My observation, and maybe this is just a Cinema's observation, right? Driving the rest, that lens of the world. But my observation is most of these families, in my opinion, understand the value and do invest.
Yeah.
The challenge comes is not on whether they would invest, in my opinion. I think the challenge comes from following through, whether they would actually properly follow through.
Right.
And because when at the starting scale, everyone's interested, excited, yeah, we will support. But when you get into the operations, when it's hitting 20% or 30% of my business, people's incentives change,
Yeah.
right? And so then your traditional existing business incentives get in the way of the startups incentives.
Right.
So that's where I saw more failures, right? So I don't think there is a lack of trying. I think there is a lack of will. And to be fair, the flip side is also true because they are startups. So it's a tricky decision to make from a group perspective to say, do I go all in with this? Because the startup can very well be riding on a coattail of that conglomerate and not actually adding value. So I need to be very fair in this, is that I understand the dilemma. The
Yeah.
dilemma is that, it's hard to follow through because so there's a chicken and egg problem here,
For sure.
right? Yeah.
Let's jump into FR8Labs. You said you went back
Yeah,
to
sure.
Singapore, you did a couple of things first, and then you must have leaned a little bit because I was going to ask you, why would you get into freight forwarding
Yeah.
when you came
Great
back? Right?
question.
I mean, nothing you've done has been traditional, so I get it. You wanted to maybe go somewhere where you'd learn something at Cinemas, and you thought nobody's doing this in Singapore. Like, I don't know. So I'm curious, like, why you even went into this space.
Yeah. So I mean, it's one of those like how Steve Jobs says it, right? You won't look, you can't see it, in front of you. It's you only piece the steps when you look backwards, right?
Right.
For me, there was a few things that kind of in the end made the stars align to this, right? So the first thing is I already had, because of Busy, because of Cinemas, a understanding of how supply chains work, right? I
Right.
wouldn't say like a practitioner, but that to the level of understanding the strategy and the commercials, yes, right? And being involved in having to build a digital business model of a freight forwarder as a part of it, right, was part of it. But when I came back to Singapore, I actually joined another startup called Gravity Supply Chain. And Gravity Supply Chain is basically a startup that, in a very simple nutshell, is a module that allows a freight forwarder to become a 4PL or a order management, supply chain management platform. So they are a module of many things. And the customers that we're dealing with in globally were like Maersk, Bolloré, BDP. So top 100, 1,000 forwarders in the world,
Big
right?
companies. Yeah.
And so I did that for a while because my previous mentor also asked me, he invested in this, asked me to help. That's one, right? But I also saw so it's an interesting next step to see how could I Like what am I missing, right? And because that was really Western centric, because most of our customers and most of the people that needed that supply chain solution, right, exists in the Western markets, because you need massive scale, big brands, global supply chains to really need to use something like this. So I did that for a while. I ended up traveling to US a bit, right, meeting partners, meeting log tech players. I saw a lot of what was happening in the US and Europe from a first-hand perspective, because I met a lot of the this Four Kites CEO several times in Chicago, and of course went to a few conferences, etc. So it was very interesting, very insightful, seeing what was happening in the US and in Europe. So as you imagine, therefore, because most of our presence was there, but I'm based in Singapore, most of my working hours was US Europe time.
Got it.
So in the day, I was pretty bored, to be honest, right? So I ended up helping my in-laws, right, as well, right, during my day, because again, I was bored during the day, and I stay with my in-laws, so kind of just nice, right? And my in-laws are actually freight forwarders as well,
Got it. Okay.
rather medium-sized global freight forwarders, right? In a slightly different format, but yeah. And I went in, I looked at it, and I was like, it was just a very interesting experience where I'm like looking at all this very interesting value adding stuff, and then looking at a very traditional day to day. And I was like, there's a huge gap, right? So that was the kind of the second star that aligned, right? First star, gravity, already engaging. Second star, freight forward, seeing what was happening here, seeing that huge, massive opportunity or gap, if you may. And then lastly, of course, this is a less well-known story, right? But equally important one, I would say. I'm still Asian at heart, in a sense that I didn't want to really get too involved with my in-laws' business, right? It's not something that I wanted to leverage off, get off. I wanted to build something of my own,
Yeah.
right? But my father-in-law actually came to me and he said, "Hey, go and take a look at now our pseudo global competitor, Go Freight." So there's this player in the US called Go Freight, Taiwan founders, but they bridged into US. And I said, okay, I'll look into it. Da, 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 da. And then he told me the story. He said one of his, or rather two of his officers in the US were kind of very early users, to some extent incubated Go Freight. So they looked at me, and Go Freight raised the Series A, is doing pretty well from what I know, right? Then he looked at me and said, why can't we do something like this, right? So, it kind of opened the door. I was like, okay, fine. You know what? Let me take a more serious look into it. The more we looked into it, the more fascinated we were by it. So, that's a bit of the how we eventually decided to say, hey, you know what? This is really great opportunity, really exciting. There's things that we can bring to the table. Let's do it. Yeah.
You were working in the CEO office at Cinemas and you had to convince. But then in your in-laws freight forwarding business, the CEO came to you and said, can we do this? So you've seen both sides of this. Glenn, that's such an awesome story. So maybe you can explain to people, because I think people understand like what logistics is, right? They have this big idea about what logistics is, about what last mile is. People talk about this all the time. But I think if you went up to anybody else besides like the people that are in the business, they wouldn't know what freight forwarding is. So what is
Yes,
it?
absolutely. Yeah. So to simplify what a freight forwarder is, a freight forwarder as a parallel, let's start with a parallel, then I'm going to do what they do. So as a parallel, they are kind of like the travel agents for cargo,
That's a
right? For
great,
containers.
it's a great analogy.
Yeah. So they're offline, right? They are offline travel agents for cargo. But that's where the parallel stops, because it's a bit more complex than personal travel,
Sure.
right? And so the complexity is you have both sides customs, you have a ton of regulations. It's not that it's different, but it's like in an immigration setting, you only have one thing to look at, right? But from a customs cargo perspective, let's take an item like Dettol, for example, Dettol soap. Dettol could be a soap, could be a disinfectant, could be many different things. And so how do you treat that from a customs perspective can get tricky
In
very,
different
very fast.
countries.
In different countries as well, right? So different countries have their own different ways of labeling this, and that's the starting point. But the other, bigger thing is that, let's say you are a global business or even a small factory, and you are exporting to, 5 countries, right? What's the likelihood that you have deep understanding
Zero. Zero.
of the cross-border?
Zero.
Don't talk about regulations, but talk about also the partners, right?
Yeah.
The truckers, what routes, what shipping lines, what, etc. Right? So that the reality is that that's what a freight forwarder is. The freight forwarder is kind of in different formats, but the two ways to think of them. One, they're a wholesaler of shipping line space, container space. But the second way to think of them is that they're kind of like a fractional logistics department of a company.
But the idea is this, is that like a small size manufacturer who wants to send something, let's say from Indonesia to the Philippines, is not going to get on the phone with Maersk Lines and say, what does it cost to get 4 pallets of my thing on there? They're going to go to a freight forwarder who's going to say, here are your 5 different options. The same way, to use your analogy, if I want to stay in Bali on vacation, I can ask my travel agent, what are the 3 best hotels? That kind of thing, yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's super manual, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's it's a very interesting industry. It's manual, and a lot of people think that that's a bad thing. I kind of have this contrarian view to this, right? Like a lot of people, a lot of freight forwarders do use Excel, and different sizes of forwarders use Excel, but there are different types of forwarders. There are forwarders that are like project cargo forwarders. So this guy is like let's say, is a offshore marine oil and gas expert,
Right.
and he has this project that they're building this mine or this platform somewhere. His job is literally just to move goods for that 3 months. He doesn't need he can just do everything in Excel, because this is very specialized. It's very one project,
it's
and he
targeted.
makes his own entire.
Like it's coming from here. It's coming from 10 places, but only going to here. That's it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his expertise is in that project management, coordination. He's a one-man show. Yeah, Excel works fine. There's nothing bad about that, right? But I think when you are dealing with, let's say, hundreds of cargo every day, right, then you face the limits of Excel very, very fast. And so that's where the manual becomes a problem. But it's also almost impossible to remove the entire notion of manual as well, because you're dealing with 6 to 7 different parties. If you were trying to do all of this yourself, so let's say you're dealing with, let's say, in my previous life, right, we're dealing with, let's say, the distributor and the retailer. Then there's a set of retailers, right? Yeah, it's easier to try to enforce standards to one player. But a freight forwarder deals with 6, 7 different players. They're dealing with the customs. Like, what's the likelihood you can change the customs to say they don't like go to full digital?
Right.
Singapore maybe, but other countries is always a tricky question. Then you have to deal with the truckers. And depending on country, you have individual truckers or companies. Right? If it's companies, again, maybe more possible. But individual truckers, again, what's the likelihood you can bring them to a digital platform easily? And then you're going to shipping lines, right? And you're going to airlines, and you're going to warehouses. Again, there's so many actors in between. So my opinion is this, right? I think the digital component is more on how do they manage their business, and how do they therefore start interacting with these guys where it's possible. But there will always be that component, because of the nature of cross-border dealing with so many different ecosystem players, that the paper becomes that commonality across the entire chain.
Yeah.
Right? It's just hard to avoid.
Yeah. I also think that in every industry that wants to go through digital transformation, there has to be a human involved at some level, because at the edge, some gal always wants to talk to some guy about that one edge condition that can't be solved by the platform. And that could be the biggest part. That could be the biggest part of the deal. Like the normal stuff that just goes through every time. But how about now if it's blue and the regulation changed and I didn't know that? I don't want to deal with a digital platform. I want to talk to the guy that has the answer, because I need it really quickly, because every day that my product doesn't get shipped is a day that I don't do sales. And it's a day where my boss is leaning over me going, why is it still here? Kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. So and so I think that kind of cuts into, therefore, the thought process of why we started FR8Labs in the way we started FR8Labs. One thing I must say is that we're kind of making it sound like, oh, then digital doesn't exist, right? But
No.
I think that's it's like digital has its place in maybe the 80% of the scenarios, and that's what really that's where we want to get to. But there is always this 20% edge cases that you need, and so you need an environment and a platform that is O2O centric, and we love this notion of O2O. It came from my background in distribution, right? But offline to online needs to integrate very nicely in a seamless.
But we learned this, Glenn, in the trading business. We could automate a whole bunch of trading, but there was, like you said, 15 to 70% of the trades that needed to have a human involved in it, and that needed to talk to the client. Because if we just automated everything, there were going to be lots of problems, right? So everything ended up being a hybrid experience, but the 80% that was automated gave us leverage to do 10 times as much business. It has to be the same for you.
Exactly. And yeah, that's our absolute kind of thought process with this, our design of our platform, and even our business model, right? So yeah, for sure.
So can you tell me how that works? Like, how are you using tech to address like these unique aspects of this? Because like you said, in the travel business, although it's a good analogy, it's not nearly as complex. So how are you using tech to handle that 80%?
So I think to take one step back to that first, right? FR8Labs is targeting Asia or Southeast Asia, right? And so we had to also observe what was the market structure of Asia or Southeast Asia. And here's what's our observation is, right? Our observation is that in general, shippers and freight forwarders kind of, maybe overgeneralizing it, but they're kind of split into two segments, right? The enterprise way of working and the SME way of working. So what we've been talking about so far is that the SME way of working is exactly that, which is a fractional logistics arm of the shipper. They don't want to get involved. They just want to move things, right? And that's the SME way of working. In the enterprise layer, it's slightly different because in the enterprise layer, there are big enough companies who have their own import-export departments.
Right.
So what do they need? They actually need a rig. They need a digital connectivity because then they want to manage as much as possible things in-house, if you may, and kind of coordinate global supply chains in-house. So it's a very different business model, right? And so when we looked at it and asked ourselves this question, so in Asia, is it more SME centric? Is more goods moved through SMEs or enterprises, right? And I mean, it's an obvious answer that we kind of beaten to death in most other industries, but it's a very SME centric. Like our estimate is like 70% of all goods.
Right.
All goods, right? Volume, right? Is
Yeah.
driven through SMEs, right? SME shippers and SME forwarders, right? So we looked at it and said, okay, we really want to solve this problem, right? It's not that we cannot build a business model on an enterprise scale, right? But if we really want to solve this problem, we really need to get into the SME layer and kind of figure out an SME solution. And so then go into the next step, which is what we covered. It's like, okay, SMEs, it's a service-driven game at its core. So because it's a service-driven game, does it make sense for us to disintermediate a forwarder, for us to become a digital forwarder ourselves? And I think that's the part that really, that's where it came out and said, wait, if we were to become a digital forwarder ourselves, we would be replacing all these people, but there will still be that service component. Theoretically, yes, we could maybe be a 10x more effective freight forwarder ourselves, but at what scale? We would have to have a huge 200,000 people army of customer service to deal with this entire market. Yeah, didn't really make sense. Could we leverage the existing supply chains? Could we leverage the existing freight forwarders, right? So, and that's how we end up saying, okay, let's build into that, like that notion, right? And ultimately, while it's not the most sexy business model, we said, let's start with a SaaS because we needed to kind of standardize a bit the ways of working of these freight forwarders for us to then be able to say layer in, all these digital services and be able to get that to that full 80% business model.
Right.
So if we are a SaaS, but we call ourselves a SaaS plus or a SaaS enabled marketplace kind of business model. The SaaS is a means to an end, if you may. So that's where we start with the journey. The first journey is that we kind of replace their existing layer. And to be fair, not all freight forwarders are just all Excel, right? There are software that they use, right? Like freight management systems or freight ERPs
Right.
that they use. But the thing that we found is that most freight ERPs, besides the global ones, were built 10, 15 years back. So they're kind of like a glorified Excel, to be honest.
Legacy tech.
So yeah, so productivity wise, there's a ton of things that the freight forwarders end up doing outside of the platform anyway. So how could we centralize that? How could we centralize emails, have a CRM component to it and enhance that workflow? But that becomes only the starting point. So that's in my opinion, 30, 40% of the digital layer. But that then allows us to then get to the second layer. So I would like to take us to pause here and use an analogy of what is the software landscape for a freight forwarder, for an option, right? So there are two options in general in the market. There is a iPhone equivalent option in the market, which is super premium, super expensive, and is a listed company in Australia called CargoWise, WiseTech, super profitable company. They target the top 1,000 forwarders in the world as an ERP, like the SAP for freight forwarding, right? That is not available to the regular forwarder, right? It's too premium. Can't afford it. It doesn't make sense when it doesn't make sense when your regular staff cost manpower is as much as the per seat license, if you may. Right? The economics just don't work anymore. Right? And then you have the other type of solutions, which is the classic software, local IT providers. And I call that the Nokia 3210 equivalent. Yeah, it works, right? You can call, you can text, but in this world, and getting more interconnected, kind of doesn't make sense. So we're building ourselves to be kind of like the Android equivalent to it. So to be able to call and text, yeah, that's the core that we have built, right? And that's, there is a digital layer to that. There's a productivity improvement to that, but that's the starting point. Then we're moving to what we call our layer two, where we help these forwarders start having the apps to interconnect with their ecosystem. So a simple example is what we call a customer portal. So again, go back to the very simple thing. Let's say you are a shipper, you are moving things from Bangkok to Singapore, right? You're moving 2 containers, right? And they will tell you, okay, roughly this is the time, right? It's gonna depart here and should arrive here at this time. After that, basically nothing happens, right? You have to call the forwarder to ask, hey, what's the status of this? You might be able to go online and check certain things yourself, but in reality, only the forwarder will actually know what has happened.
Right.
The customer service component of this is still rather manual, right? And so the simple kind of why we call ourselves a bit of the Shopify of freight forwarding is that we're giving the access for freight forwarders using that same core, doing the same things they're doing on the same core, to enable them to have a digital presence called the customer portal, right? If you may, where people can track and trace. It's a very simple thing. When you think about e-commerce, this exists everywhere. But in freight forwarding, it just doesn't exist yet, right? Not in a big way.
So Shopify and WordPress have done some really interesting things. They've built these really successful platforms that are very complex, but they've also said we can't write all the software ourselves, right? WordPress calls them plugins. They let other people come onto the platform, build plugins, and make money that way, which is an incentive for other people to build really great software. And I don't know how much they vet it. You, of course, would vet it. But if you're building a platform where people can build those plugins where they say, you haven't gotten to this yet, we can build that for you. And then all your freight forwarders have access to it. You take a cut of that revenue. Like, that's another great business model. Because you mentioned Shopify, they do the same thing as well. And there's also an opportunity for you, based on the revenue that you have from FR8Labs, but also from your legacy existing freight forwarding business, to fund some of those businesses as well and really take some of the upside there. Is that something you're looking at too?
So that's the ambition. That's why we kind of actually, instead of calling ourselves SaaS, right, we try to actually say we want to be the operating system, right?
Exactly.
Modern operating system for freight forwarders, right? But it's an infrastructure thing that we need to build. We need to build the ecosystem. We need to first build the initial layer. We need to build the first set of modules. There are internal apps. Then we will go out and really start doing it. But there are notions of this, which is I'll share. That's why I kind of mentioned core is we call our phase one. There is that customer portal that I was kind of describing, which we call phase two, right? Which really helps forwarders to have that interconnectivity to the world. But there is that phase three, which I have an example of how we end up bringing partners in, but also kind of changing the entire business model completely, right? So with the customer portal, so that means that now the forwarder has a digital presence, and they can give it to their customers. Their customers can see what's happening in the shipment. We can then layer in a digital service layer, transactional digital service layer, right? And so what is this? An example is, go back to travel. Travel is a very simple example, right? Which is that you can buy travel insurance through your online travel agencies. It's so simple, right? But it's so complex in freight forwarding today. If you go online to try to buy cargo insurance, you're gonna find everyone asking you to a set of questions and quotes and all these kind of things, right?
That was that word.
Exactly.
I love it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So so exactly to that point, right? So what we've done is actually we partnered with a global player who's the embedded insurer tech to Uber Freight in the US. They're called Redefining. And what we're doing is that we're now enabling the experience where now that your forwarder has a digital storefront to your customer can then basically top up for cargo insurance. All the information, like 95% of what we need to give you the insurance policy already exists in that normal engagement. And you're just topping up that 5%, and you can immediately get the code, you can immediately get the policy. So that's that digital service that also changes the business model, because that's not SaaS anymore, right? That's transactional driven. That's a marketplace-esque business model, right? But that's kind of how we actually are able to then scale this out. And we therefore also do it in a way that becomes a additional revenue model for your freight forwarder, right? So this is where we leverage on their volumes, but we also give them the upside. So if you think about cargo insurance in a traditional world, what happens is, yes, your freight forwarder already typically sells cargo insurance, but they do it begrudgingly, so I would say,
It's because
right?
it's hard. There's
So
friction. There's friction associated with it, and they're not insurance experts, to be fair.
exactly. So there's so much back and forth that, that's why they do make the margin, but because of so much friction, they tend not to offer it because it's not worth the man hours, right? But now that it's a one-click button experience, totally changes the entire conversation, right? And so we're bringing the forwarders onto this journey as well. They set the price to their customers, right? I'm not going to set that. I only set my price to them, right? With this entire digital experience. But so that's kind of how we think about our business model. And so that's that, hopefully that component of the Shopify model. But we need to build this, in that sense, the case studies behind this. We also need to build the volume, right? Once we have enough forwarders, plus we have, all these case studies to happen, then I think going back to the true OS kind of notion, right, will happen at that point, which is that then we can invite more players to come in and really contribute to this ecosystem.
Because you're focusing on SMEs, right, and not the largest freight forwarders in the world. There's also a funding requirement there, right? So you can also provide funding to connect to funding sources. The opportunity here is large. And I love the way, so for the people that can't see this, what I'm doing is I'm drawing a horizontal rectangle. I don't know if you did this on purpose, but like you said, the core, and you just kept doing, oh, don't do that. That's not on purpose. But you draw this thing like a core, and that's normally what I draw as like my favorite business model, because you're not building a product company. You said OS, I call it a platform company. It's the same thing, right? I mean, Shopify itself is an operating system for e-commerce. WordPress is an operating system for building websites and stuff like that. It's more complex than that. And if FR8Labs, I noticed, right? Like you didn't call it freight forwarding tech. The word labs in there makes it really interesting. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because I wanted to find out why, right? And now the whole business model makes sense to me. And when you first started, I want to go back to your father-in-law and your mom-in-law, yeah? When they first came to you and asked you to do this, did they understand all of the things that you just explained to me, that was a massive possibility? Or were they just thinking about digitizing the sort of manual processes in the freight forwarding business?
Great question. So my father, it's more a conversation with my father-in-law, right? So he is a great investor, one, right? So he's invested in many different things.
Awesome.
So and the way he looked at it was more from an investment angle to say, hey, there's an opportunity. He didn't have that specific view that say, okay, this business model is that this platform company was the right way to do it.
Right.
He just has that kind of sense. He's not the most educated person, right? He didn't come from any university. I think he barely
Whatever
got
that
through high
means
school.
anymore. But yeah, like
Right.
it hasn't stopped him.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, but this is the most interesting thing, right? I have a finance a degree, right,
Right.
from business school, right?
Yeah.
But he is one of the most savvy financial investors I've ever met
I
in my
love it.
life, right? He does things that we can only dream of from a university perspective, right? When we were studying. So very complex options, and he does accelerators and accumulators and decumulator options all day long, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, right? Anyway, point of the story is that that conversation was actually simpler, right? But he did say, look, there are many opportunities, and so it's not like one conversation actually. It ended up
Sure.
becoming 10 conversations, right? And 10 dinner conversations, right? So every dinner conversation would then actually push us to this like actually platform mix or OS or whatever we call it, right?
Yeah.
Actually makes a lot of sense because there's so much, transactional opportunities in all of this, right? And you also rightfully mentioned, because we're dealing with SMEs, financing, payments infrastructure
Yeah.
is a big thing to embed through this. And we don't want to build everything ourselves, right? That's where we want to partner, right? And so there is that whole notion we're going through, right? And we will bring partners as and when. And of course, if the partners are the right partners, then they will have us, right? We'll be happy to have those conversations. But point to the story is that, yeah, absolutely, right? I mean, that conversation was more, it developed over time. We saw different opportunities, and it's actually developing every night.
I was gonna
We have
say,
dinner,
well,
and
you said you stay with them, so like you never get away from the conversation, which is awesome, right? Because
again, same thing, luxury and a curse.
yeah, for sure, I get that.
It's hard to switch off some days, right?
I get that. I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah.
in this case, it's a slightly different story, but I do understand what you're saying. You're gathering all this data as well, and I know it's early. The company you said was founded in what, 2022, so it's still relatively early. But to the extent that you're gathering all this data, you're going to, at some point, you're going to have to build a data science team that's going to be able to analyze all that data. And then I'm just going to say it, use artificial intelligence to help the freight forwarders understand where their best businesses are, who their best performers are, where their best financing rates are, like all of these things. I presume you're planning on doing that as well.
Absolutely. And I think there's that it's not just about helping the forwarders make better decisions or connect to that better decisions, but there's the other component to this, which is that we can actually reshape certain things or certain products, right? Like
Sure.
let's talk about financial product, like let's say supply chain finance. The typical supply chain finance in the world that exists is kind of inventory financing. It's really you have a purchase order, you're gonna ship it to your customer there, you're just gonna kind of factor that specific invoice or PO. And that's all well and good, but that's really not really risk adjusted and not very, you know, data driven, if you
Right.
may.
Yeah.
But if you have access on that historical transactions, if you have access to the data of this trade lane, the transactional history, the likelihood is going to get delayed. Could there be different financial products that actually cater to these situations that's built? I think absolutely,
Yeah.
right? And dealing with the Suez Canal type incidents,
Right.
right now, right, where suddenly you imagine if you are a manufacturer today, okay, and you are exporting to the US and you usually do 90 days or 120 days terms, whatever, right?
Funding. Yeah.
And suddenly now your voyage has increased by another 60 days or 30 to 60 days to reach destination.
Right. What do you do for
If
cash
you
flow?
exactly if you are out of the money, right, or you are a small outfit, later your working capital is screwed
Yeah.
that moment onward, right? It's a combination of finance, insurance, and a bunch of things, right? But with data, all those products changes, right? And all those opportunities changes, in my opinion. So I definitely the ambition is, yes, definitely to go to that direction. But I'll take a step back. You also mentioned AI, right? So we actually have a unique thought process to AI, right? My co-founder is a very creative, innovative, hacky guy, right? I love to death that we continue to work together, despite our arguments. But anyway, he has, we love where the entire industry is going from a Gen AI perspective and all these kind of things. And we looked at it and say, okay, how can we do something practical from a freight forwarding perspective? So what we were able to do is that we were able to kind of POC that you can actually do a voice recording and say, hey, help me create this shipment, help me create a quotation, and it literally transcribes and pushes directly to our FR8Labs platform, right? But there's a very real reason why we want to do this. So we go back to the whole issue of how do you actually properly digitize this entire end-to-end thing?
Right.
And we have like 6, 7 actors, all these different actors, truckers, who might not be able to interact with you digitally because they
Right.
don't have the systems.
Yep.
So interfacing and APIs and a fully digitally connected, interconnected supply chain or logistics chain is like a holy grail of logistics or supply chain. But I think very hard to get to. What I think is easier to get to is pseudo interfaces. If we could perfect this Gen AI interaction between a using WhatsApp, right? Basically any chat layer, right? We can basically go to all the actors in between and say, instead of interacting with me on a paper, can you interact with me in a WhatsApp? And we're not actually asking you to change the way you work. Do a voice recording or natural language text to interact with us. That I think can drive huge adoption, right, of digital and really create next layer opportunities in logistics, freight forwarding, supply chains. So, that's something that for us is that more midterm goal, right? Like
Right.
how do we create pseudo interfaces between the forwarder and the trucker, the forwarder and their customers, forwarder and any other actor in between.
Right. I mean, this
Yeah.
gets back to your O2O example, right? Because they're not necessarily as digitalized as people that are sitting at a desk. It could be a trucker, it could be anybody, it could be somebody moving a pallet around. It doesn't really matter. But you're giving them the opportunity to interact with the digital system in a way that they're already doing anyway, that they already know how to do. But this brings up another question for me. Is there a way, because now that you take your system, right, it's got to be a two-sided system, right? So the freight forwarder has to have it, but then also the people with whom they're dealing have to have it as well, right? So my question is this, is that once you install the system, this sort of SaaS plus system, and all these SME and small, right, and medium-sized enterprise freight forwarders, do you then have the possibility, because this will make your digital example, right, your voice example easier, to standardize all of the forms that they use, the digital forms that they use, so then you can parse all that data exactly the same and it falls in the same place no matter who's dealing with it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So I think standardizing, so the reality is we're already doing it in some form, because I think when we think about customization and all these different business processes, there's always two ways to deal with things. And it goes back to the SaaS business thought process or the OS business process anyway, is that we need to be very conscious in our design of how do we make that a process that is pseudo standardized. It will not be 100% standardized,
Yeah.
but configurable. It's not customized. It's configurable to your needs, but then the database, the backend structure is the same, the schemas are the same, such that the language, you create a standardized language on some level, right? And that's why it's kind of OS like, right? It's like Android to apps.
The standardization is hidden from the customer. They don't even need to know it's there. You tell them it's customizable. But even those customizable formats or fields, you already know about, right? And you can add new ones as you go along, and then everyone has access to it. So if they add that field, whatever it is, everyone has access to it. Again, the same data drops into the same place for everybody, even though it feels like it's customized. Yeah,
Absolutely. And of course, there's a struggle from a design and
for
a
sure.
SaaS development perspective, right? But I think it's something that's very worth to do, right?
Absolutely.
And so far, it actually, we at first we thought it was a pain, but we built the infrastructure to do it, and now it's become sort of a differentiator, which is nice, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So there was something called the fixed protocol in the trading world, where once they digitalized the acceptance of orders and when all the exchanges went digital, there was a protocol system that sat above everybody, right? And everybody said it was called FIX. Like everybody had to use all of those fields. And again, you didn't have to use all of them. You didn't have to use half of them. But if you wanted to take an order electronically, you had to use FIX to do it. And if you're building that, the leverage you building into your system is just massive, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So definitely that's the ambition. And yeah, so far we've been lucky in our journey. We have a good set of pipeline and existing customers to get there. We're quite confident we can get there though, because I think as long as we continue focusing on how we add value, and the way we actually think about our business model is that as well, because we are building a second, third layer, we can afford to be very competitive on our core
Sure.
SaaS.
This is the Microsoft Intel thing, right? It's just like, we'll give you the operating system for $39, but then you have to pay $500 for Microsoft Office, right? I mean, same thing.
Absolutely. So therefore we can be a bit more aggressive on OS. And so that kind of keeps us very competitive right now. But of course, we're not going to go crazy and kind of subsidize growth, right?
Sure.
It's try to break even on the core, but then massive upside on everything else.
Okay. I'm going to let you go. I feel like I've taken up way too much of your time. This was really, really interesting. And I learned a ton today. Hopefully you enjoyed this as much as I did. Glenn Lai, a co-founder and the CEO of FR8Labs. Really awesome. Thank you so much for doing this today.
Likewise. Thanks much for inviting me. Thank you. It was a very enjoyable chat.